And now for a closer look at the key takeaways from the high-stakes meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. We're joined today by Professor Mason Richey, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Richey, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So the White House described this meeting as highly productive, while she also called U.S.-China relations the world's most important. How would you assess the overall outcome of the meeting yesterday?
Yeah, so low expectations, I think, were telegraphed in advance, and I think at least so far that's what we've seen. Both Xi and Trump are aiming at stability, floor on the relationship between the U.S. and China, resting on at least what appears to be superficially a sort of a relationship of respect of some variety or other between Xi and Trump personally. China's talking about this stability in U.S.-China relations even going on, I think they said in their readout, for the next 3 years and even beyond. But certainly, something as grandiose as a structure for a G2 is going way too far. Both Trump and Xi think that their national strength advantages are significant, and time is on their side. So there's no need for any type of, sort of sphere of influence division, that a sort of G2 type of situation would imply. Overall, I think the agreement for now is much more modest. They're aiming at stability. They're aiming at guardrails on the relationship. They're aiming at some predictability over the medium term. And of course, most of the underlying issues, notably, of course, Taiwan, remain points of contention that are unresolved.
Right, and Trump also says she offered to help broker peace with Iran, and they also agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must stay open. So how might this meeting affect the course of the conflict in Iran?
Yeah, so apparently the U.S. says in its version of the readout from yesterday that China said that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open and toll-free. The Chinese readout just mentions the Middle East in broad terms. However, I'm willing to believe the United States report on what it is that she said or China as a official policy has taken on the Strait of Hormuz, because that's consistent with what China's position already was. And of course, China has an interest, obviously a significant interest, in the Strait of Hormuz remaining open and toll-free. The U.S. also says that China said that it would agree to mediate between the U.S. and Iran and agree not to sell weapons to Iran. Again, this is not in the Chinese readout. If that's true, that might matter, especially perhaps the weapons delivery part of the equation, if China were indeed to not send weapons, or even more importantly, perhaps components for weapons that Iran could assemble itself. But we don't know that that's the case. And even if China said that, we don't know if they're going to actually hold to that. And so I think, the apparent agreement of China also to buy U.S. hydrocarbons and maybe slightly reduce some of its purchases in Iran in the future, might make a difference as well. But I think ultimately China, realizes that the United States has gotten itself into this problem, and it's in China's interest to force the U.S. to get itself out of this problem, at least for the short and medium term.
I see. And on Taiwan, in a closer meeting, Xi reportedly told Trump that differences over this issue, Taiwan, could bring the U.S. and China into conflict. And there was speculation that Beijing is expected to sort of press Trump on this issue. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, certainly China pressed the United States on this issue, as it always does. This was utterly, again, to be expected. China maintains its one China principle. The United States, however, has not changed at all its one China policy, which are not the same thing. And the United States, continues to advocate for the status quo, and China continues to treat the Taiwan issue as an internal issue that is, non-negotiable. And so, yes, both sides have essentially reiterated their position. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also made that comment and basically said, yes, both sides brought up their traditional positions. Nobody budged, nobody moved. And now we've moved on to other topics, as usually happens in these U.S. China meetings. I think the interesting thing to see might be whether or not the U.S. Ends up executing a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan that's on the table. This would come shortly after a slightly more than $10 billion deal that went through earlier. So if the United States continues to deliver weapons to Taiwan, again, I don't really see at all how the United States position would have changed.
And there wasn't any sweeping trade breakthrough or major business agreements, right? How did the meeting turn out in terms of economic ties between the two countries?
Yeah, so I'm a little surprised, and most of this meeting so far hasn't really surprised me, but I was a little surprised that we didn't see something more directly about the rare earth from China side of the equation and the United States AI chip side of the equation, where the ramp down in tension in the trade relations between the U.S. and China is really focused to some degree on a trade détente from several months ago, where the United States basically said, okay, we're willing to open up exports of some high-end chips, notably from NVIDIA, their second best AI-related graphics processing units to China, as long as China keeps the rare earth supply chain relatively open, going back in the other direction. And we didn't really see any mention of that, which I guess you could read as a sort of silent consent by both sides to continue with the way things are, but they didn't seem to use that as a build out for something bigger. Instead, what we've seen are some sort of modest announcements about agricultural purchases by China, some perhaps additional U.S. market access into China, some Chinese investment in the United States, and the setting up of a board of trade to deal with some of these tariffs and trade issues. Although Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, indicated that this is going to take a while to get going. Some perhaps aircraft purchases from China, from U.S. manufacturer Boeing, but it doesn't seem like there was a big structural move at all in the trade relationship.
Right. All right, Professor Richey, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.